Okay, the streaming should be started. Confirmation.
It's working?
Yes, no, maybe so. Coming through loud and clear. Okay. I think the audio should be working.
Hello, everyone, in Canadian. Hey.
Okay. I think we're good. I'm going to do a dance first. Yeah, no, the YouTubers are going to see both screens when I switch them.
The audio's good.
Okay. All right. So, guys, we've got a special guest all the way from northern climes of Canadian Alberta. Phil Rowley, you might have heard of him. He's fished stillwaters a few times. Twice. He's been doing this for a couple weeks. So anyway, we're going to have more people trickle in here, but we're just going to go ahead and get started. We'll do a presentation. Phil's got some really good stuff on chironomids. This is really good stuff. So, and it'll be stored on YouTube, so if you want to come and look at it later, you can do that. And afterwards, we'll have some time for some Q&A. And so if anybody's got any questions, think of them both online, streaming, live on YouTube, and here in the shop. So anyway, with that said, Phil.
Thank you, Curtis.
It is your deal.
Great to be here. So we're going to talk to you about advanced chironomid tactics tonight. Okay. Turn, please. Why aren't we turning?
Are you not going?
You're not going.
We'll deal with that here.
All right. We have more than one slide. Are we looking all right?
Hold on.
We've got just the splash screen there.
Do you try it?
Oh, there we go. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is from a basis point is just sort of review the existing tactics most people I see use today in my travels around North America with chironomid fishing. We're going to spend a fair bit of time talking about the life cycle of chironomids and the relationship for fly patterns. Because that's always important, what flies to use. We're going to talk about indicator techniques and then go into deep water indicator techniques. Talk about probably my favorite way to fly fish lakes with a floating line and a long leader that we affectionately call the naked technique because it has no indicator on the leader. And then some slow sinking line tactics where we're using hover lines, clear intermediates, those kind of things. And then fishing vertically using fast sinking density compensated lines, a technique we call dangling. We're limping along here. We're going. Uh-oh. Not quite. That's way down the list. You don't need to look at that right now.
Sorry guys, we had this and then
Yeah, it was working like a charm.
made some changes.
Tell me when to push the button. Say when?
Yeah, go for it. Whoops.
Oh.
I'm on the wrong screen here.
Yeah. Oh.
Now go. Okay.
There we go. So, if we using as a basis point, most fly fishers today like to target shallow water, and frankly, as a fly fisher on lakes, water 20 feet deep or less is arguably the best to be, and that's for me two primary reasons. The first of all, that's where all your weed growth is going to take place. Photosynthesis stimulates plant growth through the sun's energy. As you get deeper than that, the effect of the sun's energy lessens. You get less weeds, less habitat for food. And in that shallow water, as fly fishers, we can use a wide range of presentation techniques, from floating lines to indicators, to full sinking lines, to the washing line, to all these different techniques that some of you may have heard of. And when we're fishing chironomids, most people are doing it fishing strike indicators. And it works very well because it controls the depth of your presentation, which is really critical with chironomid fishing, and the speed of your retrieve, because you can just let it sit there, you can creep it in slowly, you can strip it in, you can do lots of different things. And that was the basis for the Conquering Chironomids Volume 1 DVD that Brian Chan and myself put out. And then we also put together an advanced DVD, because it should change to the new color. I'm probably scrolling through about 7 different slides now. Oh, I'm way up. Yeah, because we're going, how are we doing now? There we go. So this is volume 2, and advanced is it's maybe a better term is alternative techniques that people perhaps don't use as much with their, such a reliance on strike indicators, and because it works so well. So let's start with the life cycle. So this is what the primary point when we fish chironomids, we're fishing subsurface. 85% of the time I'm probably fishing pupal imitations. 15% of the time I'm fishing larval imitations, and if my math is working right, 5% on adults. On productive still waters where chironomids are a key food source, actually the most important food source throughout the open water season, you're going to spend your time fishing subsurface, because that's where the food is, just above the bottom. Fish are not going to expose themselves to dine on a prey such as an adult chironomid when it's only there for a second and it's gone. It's much easier eating to eat just above the bottom. So these are the first stage, the larval stage. Well, the first stage is the egg, then the larval stage, commonly called bloodworm. Because many species have the ability to retain hemoglobin, which allows them to live in oxygen-poor water. So they live right on the bottom. Most species, they construct little tubes along the bottom. They feed on detritus, which is decaying plant matter, and decomposition. One of the byproducts of decomposition is reduced oxygen. So that's why they're red. And they come in a wide range of sizes, segmented, worm-like. That's the head of the chironomid pupa larva right there. The tail, little V-tail, and they range, I've seen them from too small to imitate to, in some of the productive muddy bottom lakes of the Pacific Northwest that they favor, almost an inch long. So big. We're fishing 8, 2x, 3x long chironomid larva patterns at times. Oh, we lost our video. That's fine. So the larva then transforms into the pupa. And when most people say I'm fishing chironomids, this is the stage they're referring to. And this is the larva seals itself off, transforms into the pupa. The pupa then cut their way free, and they'll suspend and elevate just above the bottom. And then after a period of time, they'll have enough of those gases, and we're going to come to those gases in a few slides later, that silvery, shiny look, that aids their ascent through the surface, up to the surface, and also their final transformation to winged adult. And you'll see they're very slender, slight taper to the abdomen area, the wing pads, and the prominent white gills at the head of the chironomid. Some species have smaller, lighter, finer gills at the tip of the abdomen, but most of the time we're just imitating the gills at the head of the abdomen with our flies. The head of the abdomen. So wide range of colors. Black is by far the most predominant chironomid color you're going to see. And that's where most of my flies are targeted, in those dark colors, but there are different kinds. Those are probably a size 10, and you can see how the tip of the abdomen was clear there. And a lot of times you'll see actual residual hemoglobin from the larval stage gather there, and that's why you'll see patterns with red butts on them and red wire ribs as well, to imitate residual hemoglobin that gathers along the abdominal segments. Oh, yeah. Yes, right there. Good segue. Give that man a pop. So, understanding it's important to understand the bugs both from an imitative point of view as far as your presentation, and of course flies. So when it comes to chironomid larva patterns, I like them very skinny and segmented. These are not patterns that generally inspire a lot of confidence in fly fishers, because there's nothing more to them. They're nothing more than a red stick. In fact, there's an English pattern called the Datsun. For those of you who remember the Datsun car before they became Nissan, it was actually red automotive touch-up paint on a hook. That's how simple they can become. We put at times little tufts of marabou or similar materials in the tail, not to imitate any tail, but just to give motion to that fly, because we're trying to imitate that sort of writhing, wriggling motion of the natural pupa. We're going to present these most of the time near the bottom, typically within a foot of the bottom. There are times, however, that they will get swept up in a windstorm, or I've seen diving birds like coots go down and pull up vegetation, and of course they'll disturb a bunch of chironomid larvae, and once they get in the drift, they're pretty hapless and they're at the mercy of the elements. I tend to, because the chironomid larva will wiggle and then pause in almost an extended position at times, tend to, in cast and retrieve techniques, I'll use straight shanked versions. More so under an indicator, I'll use a curved hook tied with a non-slip loop knot, jiggling under an indicator. It's going to sort of suggest a more of a writhing, wriggling larval pattern. Pupa patterns, we try to keep them nice and slender, almost hook shank. You can have a slight taper in the abdomen up towards the bead, but you don't want fat and obese chironomids. Montana Fly Company ties our chironomid pupa patterns for Brian and I always joke with them, you will never see an email from us that our flies are too skinny. You can't make them skinny enough. We like them nice and skinny. Ice cream cone patterns are very popular nowadays, and that is the pattern with the prominent white bead on it. And I'm going to talk more in depth about beads on chironomid patterns. And curved shank patterns are common. So curved scud hooks, or 2XL curved nymph hooks. There's lots of tires like that style of hook, like a Daiichi 1760, I think, is the 2X curved, and the 1120 scud hooks. But there's lots of good brands out there to use nowadays. Patterns, again, must be thin. You should have a collection of patterns tied on curved shanked hooks, and I have come into situations where tying a pattern on a straight shank standard hook works, because early in the emergence, those chironomids don't move very much. And in really selective conditions where, these are fish that have been pricked more than a few times and are starting to get a little wary, they will orientate themselves and prefer at times one profile over another. That's extreme. The gills are always worth imitating. The most common way is with a white bead, but there's other methods too, yarn and things like that. We use contrasting ribs to suggest segmentation, attraction, reinforce the fly a little bit, and generally hook sizes. I tie my chironomid patterns anywhere from a size 8 right through down to probably an 18, probably a 12, down this neck of the woods, 12, 14, 16s. I was fishing a lake in British Columbia in August where we get these big bombers coming off. We were fishing size 8, 2, and 3XL pupa patterns to match the size of the chironomids. They were that big. We call them bombers because when the adults fly off, they look like a B-52. They can barely get airborne. They're so big. So pupal patterns, lots of different kinds. This is a clearwater pupa. We'll come back to that a little bit more, but that's more of an imitative style fly that I tend to use in selective conditions. This was the traditional way we used to tie chironomids before beadheads became available, was a standard, what we call a chironomid thorax, was a peacock herl thorax, white yarn gills, Fentex at the time, and a pheasant rump or pheasant tail thorax. And this one's actually finished behind the gills first, the wing case first, then the gills, peacock herl wound back, pulled over everything back, so that wing case would help divide the gills for that. And then beads came along, because it was one of the challenges was, how do you get these patterns to sync? Because if you weighted them, they became too fat and weren't didn't look natural and were sometimes refused. So when beads came along, I was all over. I just slide this on the hook and fly sinks. Sold. How much of these? Buying 100. So they provide an element of attraction to the fly. They help provide some form to the fly as well, help suggest that thorax area. Of course, they add weight. We use white beads to imitate the gills. And generally, I like to use white bead patterns in stained water. Lots of algae, because if you use yarn gills or floss gills, they get gunked up and can get turned a green tinge. And but there are times white can be too stark. I've fished in clear water situations and the fish seem to shy away and not respond well to an all white bead pattern. And one of the things you always want to have in your kit bag or in your lakes is a little Sharpie, buy the Sharpie with the fat end and the skinny end, and you actually take a Sharpie and you can color up the bead a little bit and knock it down so it's not so much. Tungsten versus brass, I rarely use tungsten-based flies when I'm chironomid fishing because I like to fish a number of different ways, and tungsten sinks simply too fast. So I'll use brass beads and use other ways to get the flies to sink more. A swivel, we'll talk about that. Additional flies, even a little bit of split shot now and then. And these thin-bodied flies sink very, very quickly. And we want to track them through the water nice and slow as well. And for bead sizes, I usually step it down from, if you were to tie a size 10 pheasant tail, it would probably call for a 1/8 bead. For a size 10 chironomid pupa, I tie on 7/64ths. And for 12s and 14s, I use 3/32. And for smaller than that, I use 5/64ths. Okay? And the other reason I don't use tungsten is by the end of the day, I got flies all over the map. And I...
From Canada?
Yes.
Could you give us the metric system?
Oh, like, no. They changed over for me in grade 7, and I've been messed up ever since. Yeah, I'm always amazed that I see your recipes on the site. They're all in millimeters. I'm like, aren't you guys standard still? And we're up in Canada doing 7s. Oh, definitely easier. It's all in 10s. My 2 sons don't understand the standard system at all. They think we're crazy. What's a foot? So other proportions, again, thin patterns, slender. If you want to add taper, try and keep it in the front third of the body. If you put a bud on it, we want it subtle, so 3 or 4. This is Brian's beadhead chironomid bomber. It's got 4 turns of wire. Sometimes we use red holographic mylar as a personal favorite of mine to use as a butt section. The target when you rib is to get 7 ribs for 9 sections. There are some tyers I know that are fastidious about that. I don't think fish can count. I would just get into a nice open spiral and go with it. If fish can count, we're not catching that one in. Right? If they can count these ribs, how come they can't see this thing, which we're thankful for? If we're using a non-bead-headed thorax, we try to keep it about 1/4 of the shank. Gills, trim them and use the bead as the proportion. So I'll trim the gills the same length as the bead, so no matter what size, they're proportional. Sometimes you'll see chironomid patterns, you know, it's not an emerger wing on it, right? It's just a little tuft of gills. And I do prefer yarn gills, so I will use materials. I like materials that fluoresce a little bit, that'll glow when we're fishing deeper, because we often fish chironomids 14, 15 feet down, and that'll gather any available light and fluoresce a little bit. And my current favorite right now is uni floss, as opposed to uni stretch, because it fluoresces. So if you take a little UV light and shine on it and it pops back white, that's something I'll use. I've been through lots of gill materials. I think I'm the killer of gill materials, because as soon as I find one I like, they discontinue it on me. So. Okay, small patterns, they can be challenging, right? Because we're, you know, in a lot of the productive lakes, we're fishing for larger fish, and of course, larger fish like to straighten out smaller, lighter wire hooks. So a couple of ways to work around that. If you notice in this picture here, we've got 2, this is a green and copper, just a green holographic mylar with a copper bead, copper wire rib. That the body on this number 12 ends here, a 16 length fly on that hook, kind of a low water style, if you're familiar with that with salmon and steelhead patterns. Just, again, working on the premise, thankfully the fish don't seem to take any offense to the hook and eat the fly. Another way to do it was a friend of mine, Les Robinson, in British Columbia, after having a frustrating day of trying to hook large 5-pound plus rainbows on size 16 chironomids and hook straightening all over the place, he came up with this double header philosophy. Kind of like you see cluster tricos and things like that, actually tying 2 chironomid pupa back to back on a size 12 or 14 2XL curved nymph hook. So both of these methods work, and I've got little samples in here. In fact, I do have some fly patterns here you guys are welcome to look at, and I know exactly how many's in here. So you and Herb. Yeah. One of the things that we've started doing in recent years is using a tractor chironomid. And it's based on the premise that fish don't always take our flies out of a feeding response. We can trigger a reaction for them. And we do that by exaggerating. We exaggerate the sizes, we exaggerate colors, we exaggerate how we present them. And sometimes the fish want one of these things, two of them, all three together. So we tie large patterns. A number of years ago, I was doing one of my stillwater seminars. One of my customers came on the water a little late, and we had been fishing. We got a few fish on size 14s. We'd done some throat pump analysis. That was matching. We still weren't getting the fish we thought we should have. He comes out, anchors up, makes a cast, boom, he's into a fish. Beginner's luck, right? Everybody's bugging him and teasing him. Well, after about 7 casts, 7 fish, now, I'm prairie dogging. My ears are up. What are you doing? He says, oh, I'm tying one of those, your flies. So I know I don't have that in my box, right? Because that's always the way it works. He's fishing a size 10 3XL bomber, like the one there. They're eating 14s, and they're eating a size 10 3X, like Halloween candy to a kid. They just couldn't leave it alone. So that's an example of exaggeration. We also fish really bright flies. A friend of mine up in British Columbia, John Kent, ties a lot of these things. He's kind of the Kelly Gallup of fly naming. He's got Bleeding Elvis. This is the Blind-Eyed Charlie. These are flies that really stand out and are totally like, why would a fish even eat that? And we fish them aggressively. If you're fishing them under an indicator, you're not letting them sit, you're not creeping them in, you're giving them 1-foot pulls to raise that fly up and flutter it down and draw fish over to them. So attractor chironomids are something to think about in your fly box. You're not always, as you think, matching their hatch. You're kind of matching the hatch as far as you're putting a chironomid on, but you're exaggerating how big it is, how gaudy it is, and the way you're presenting it. Lean and small patterns come into play on fish. I particularly like to use these on really clear lakes where fish can see your fly for it seems like miles, or fish that have seen a lot of anglers. They've been hooked a few times. You catch one and it's more like it's got body piercings all over it from all the slow, it's a slow learner. So we use this. These are English epoxy style buzzers that we tie up. They're fun to tie. They're kind of imitative. They're hard bodied. They're coated with a variety of coatings people use, from nail polish to brushable head cement to the many clear UV resins out there. We use those as well. More imitative flies like this. This is one of mine, a version I call the Clearwater Pupa. You can take any standard fly you like that's a beadhead and just swap out the beadhead from this more imitative thorax that we use either mylar along the sides for wing cases or pull stretch floss or super floss up along the side and tie it off. It's a very imitative looking fly. They're fun to tie. So that's so again, some of the different flies you have in your boxes, you're going to have attractor patterns, you're going to have large patterns, small patterns, natural looking patterns, and some of these more imitative stuff for different odds. These are also good flies to fish when fish are up, actually will come up on the surface and feed. We see that with those big bombers I was mentioning, where there's enough of them on the surface, they'll come up and start taking size 10 adults and pupa hanging below. And this is a good pattern just to fish on a floating line, cast it out, let it sit, and just slowly hand twist it back and wait for everything to lock up as the fish takes it, because it doesn't sink too fast like a beadhead. So some tips on all of this, just some generalities to help you get through. I find on clearwater lakes, the chironomid pupa tend to be a little smaller in size, so I'll probably start 12 through 16. On some of the muddy bottom lakes, lots of algae, you'll see some bigger chironomid species, probably 12 and larger. These are just general guidelines. You're always going to have exceptions, of course. If fish are fussy and have seen a lot of flies, that's when I'm going to go to those more imitative ones that maybe don't have bead heads on and that flash. They sort of know that shiny copper or gold one stings a bit. I actually will use, if 14s are coming off, I'm not adverse to putting a 12 or a 10 on to stand out in the crowd and appeal to that greed factor of a trout, right? Fluorescence we'll talk about a bit more, but I do like to incorporate fluorescence into my flies, particularly ones I'm using deeper. And then again, that curved hook that'll help suggest a more active wiggling pupa, and then also straight shanked hooks for ones that are not moving so much. And again, black is the most predominant color. If I had one chironomid color to fish with, it would be a black bodied pupa with a red rib. That's your bread and butter, start the day fly. If you're looking for a starting point, pick a black and red. Shiny patterns, and we're going to talk more about those as well when the emergence is strong because of the effect of the gases they use. And in all these patterns, its presentation trumps fly all the time. Everybody likes, I joke about this, everybody likes to blame the fly, because if the fly isn't the problem, the only thing left is you, right? And nobody wants to necessarily always admit that maybe they're not presenting the fly properly. And you'll find there's always a downsizing in chironomids, so the larvae always tend to be larger than the pupa, which are in turn larger than the adult, right? So if 12s are coming off, 14 pupa might be a more appropriate size if you can catch one of the adults flying by. So color is important in chironomids and in flies in general. And just some basic things is obviously as sunlight penetration lessens with depth, so is the effect of color. And the long wavelength colors like reds are the first to fade. And the way we remember this is Roy G. Biv. I'll show you a slide of that in a second. Turbidity, suspended matter always affects colors as well. And trout like us have rods and cones. So cones for color, rods for contrast, so they can see those things. And trout don't see all that well. Their best vision is when they're staring right with their binocular vision right in front. So that's, I think, one of the things that makes our flies work. I don't think they see it. If they saw flies, I think, in the same way we saw them, this would be a golf seminar or something else, because this wouldn't be fly fish food. It'd be golf and clubs and stuff. Thank God it's not. This is actually a cheap iPhone shot. But these pupa here have just transformed from the larval stage. So see how they're very maroon in color? And then as this video progresses, there's even a chironomid larva here. And this fly, see how they're slowly wriggling? There's not a lot of movement amongst them. These just transformed. And when I did my first book, Fly Patterns for Still Waters, I actually had a 30-gallon aquarium in my garage. That's as far as my wife would let it in the house. And I remember seeing a chironomid pupa starting to emerge along the bottom, and I separated them from the rest of the group in there because they would have eaten them. It's a dog-eat-dog world down there. And put them in a breeding tank. That pupa didn't hatch until 4 days later. So this staging process can go on for days because it takes a while for them to sort of complete their transformation and gather these trapped gases that they need to ascend. Because you can see some of these pupae here, I don't know if you noticed, but this one here is starting to turn olive. He's going from that red coloration to the olive coloration as he goes, and then he'll start to brighten up as he gets more and more gases. So it's kind of bad enough they're all different sizes and colors. Some of these species, and there's over 2,500 species, I think, in Western North America alone, I've been told. They're even able to change their color as they go through their emergence process. Just more fun to the puzzle. So again, this color spectrum is important. That Roy G. Biv, it stands for red, orange, yellow, green, indigo, and violet. That's the color range. So above this is into your infrared range. We can't see. Your shorter range is into that UV range. That's the range humans can see, and fish see in that same range too. There's been lots of conjecture over the years, and this also works this way. So the deeper you go, these are the colors that will appear better. So in deep water chironomids, we actually tie them in purples and blues. Never seen a blue or purple chironomid, but it's just that color will stand out at depth better than a red that turns kind of a grayish color very quickly. And this also works if you tilt that graphic on its side. The further the fish is away from the fly horizontally, diagonally, the effect of the light levels also, the effect of how the fish sees it. So UV is important. The fluorescence. So this is one of my favorite deep water chironomid larva patterns. It's called the bionic worm. It's originated by Jerry McBride, who kind of started the whole balanced fly craze, which I'm a big believer of. It features a fluorescent pink tail. We used to use stretch scudback over the body. I now use buzzer wrap or a frostbite, a thin over gold holographic mylar, and a hot orange bead. So definitely a non-standard. If I put that in the palm of your hand instead they're on bloodworm, you're like, well, they don't look like that at all. But this fly, I'd say in water deeper than 15 feet deep, and rainbows in particular, love this thing. It really stands out, and those fluorescent colors pop.
Is that an orange bead?
Yeah, hot fluorescent orange. It's almost an attractor larva pattern, but it stands out. I find this fly For me, has not been as effective in shallower water, where I think a little more light gets out and it may be a bit too overt for the trout at that time, but there's always exceptions, of course. This is important as well, is understanding chironomids. Mayflies do this. Caddis, Gary LaFontaine talked about it in his book, Caddis Flies. The effect of the gases that the chironomid pupa generate underneath their pupal skin. It provides buoyancy and helps them get out of the shuck up at the surface. It kind of expels them. And the more closer to hatching, the more inflated they become, the more active they become, the more they start to wriggle. So a lot of flies nowadays, we use a lot of bright, shiny materials, flashaboos, things like this. And we didn't really stumble upon this until we started using throat pumps. And I'm going to talk about how to use those in a little bit, because that really, it's an important tool when you're chironomid fishing. So we use a lot of silver flashaboos, anti-static bags, window tinting film that you use for automotives. You cut it in automotive uses. We cut it into thin strips. Black holographic mylar. There's a host of different materials to get that look. And this was sort of the pattern I sort of known for, is the chromie. That is a silver flashaboo body, originally with a red wire rib, and then when the holographic mylars and flashaboos came out, a nice size small red holographic mylar. And nowadays I tie these with green mylar ribs, purple, blue, hot pink, all different kinds. You could fill a box with chromies, and it's worked very well. And I'm still a traditionalist. A lot of tyers nowadays will use thread thoraxes for speed, and you can coat the whole thing and turn it bulletproof. I still like a little peacock curl in the fly. I don't think you can hurt a fly by putting peacock in it. So the reason for this is the throat pump, and it's this little guy here, your little turkey baster, right, that allows you to sample what the fish is eating. We're actually sampling, although they're sold as stomach pumps, I call them throat pumps, because that's what you want. I want what they just ate, not what I want down here. And obviously they identify what it is, how big the prey item is. It has no real negative effects on the prey characteristics. So when you pump something out and put it into the little vial or a container, it's still going to be shiny and bright. Whereas if you sample out of a stomach sample, the stomach acids negatively, kill the prey, and then all the lifelike qualities that the fish were attracted to are gone. And the best part, of course, is the fish survives. Now, I don't pump every fish. First guy always gets it, right? That's just what you get for being greedy and, and first up. So to use these things, I lubricate by filling them full of water and squirting it out. So it's moist on inside and out. And then I ensure the bulb is empty. If the fish is struggling, you can invert it. It kind of disorientates them temporarily. Most of the times I do it using a wooden landing net right beside the boat. Then fish is in the net, and it'll lie still better for you. You depress the bulb, not by yelling at it, but just give it a squeeze like this. And then when that goes down the throat of the trout, the longitudinal muscles of the esophagus instinctively want to grab this thing, and it creates a suction, and the bulb stays collapsed. So you don't have to touch the prey to get it, and when you withdraw the pump, you'll hear an audible suck, and this black mass disappear up into the bulb, release the fish, let it go. The whole process takes seconds once you get comfortable with it, and let the trout go. And it really provides some key information, and particularly with chironomid fishing, because you can have fish every hour on a different size and color if there's lots of different species coming off. So it allows you to stay in touch. Uh-oh. Have we lost it again? I'm good? I am. Okay. So not only, again, this is an interesting sample. So this was a fish I caught in about 14 feet of water. In the sample here, these are scuds that are dead. So this was food source early in the morning. Scuds this is about 11 o'clock. Scuds are not big fans of bright light. They like the shallow water. That fish was probably in the shallows, had a few scuds for breakfast. Light comes on the water, scuds retreat to cover. The fish feels less secure, slides out into deep water. The chironomids are starting to emerge, and they're actually starting to hatch. So it gives you an indication of feeding depth as well when you link the food source you've seen in the sample with where they live, right? So all those are kind of near the bottom. The pupa, and of course, catching it 1 foot off the bottom in 14 feet of water is a pretty good clue as to where it was too. And the feeding activity. These things were wiggling and writhing around. So that fish is actively feeding. So you can be pretty rest assured that if you put a fly on that matches those wriggling pupae, you should have some success. And this is what gets you excited in the throat pump sample. These things are wiggling like mad. You can see how shiny and inflated they are, and they actually have a chromie with a copper or a holographic brown or orange rib would probably be a good fly to use right now. And I look at it this way: over the course of my fishing career, I probably saved over 500,000 insects' lives. Gone on to have families and careers, all in the space of 24 hours or less. But that's why a throat pump is so important, particularly with chironomid fishing. It allows you to stay in touch because you can have situations where you're catching a lot of fish and it starts to taper off. And yet there's still chironomids coming off, fish still seem to be in the area. Catch another fish, give them a throat sample, it's changed. Change the size, change the color, and then you alter your presentation and hopefully keep in touch with the fish. So we'll talk about, let's go into how do we, got these flies, how do we make them work for us? Strike indicator tactics have become very popular, and ironically, from the way I learned fish chironomids, strike indicators was the last thing I learned how to use, not the first, because when I started doing this, strike indicators weren't around. And I like the key thing with indicator presentations is between your indicator and your fly or your flies, it is level leader. So the fly sinks true. That's the most important part. I like these indicator leaders. They're 10 feet long. They have a short section, about this long, 2 or 3 feet, like this. Pass those around. The orange coloration on them means nothing to me. That's just the way they come. So they're about this long. So between my fly line and my indicator, I have a little backbone to help turn this mess over, right? Because these long, thin leaders with swivels on them, multiple flies, an indicator can be problematic to cast at times, and then it'll sink straight through. It quickly transforms after that short butt section into level leader, and then I quickly add tippet to build the overall leader length that I want, right? And I like to indicator fish probably when I'm fishing 15 feet of water or less is my sort of preferred range. You can certainly do it more, and I'll talk about deep water methods in a bit. But this is important. So most people think, oh, just put on a tapered leader, right, and add some tippet, jam on a bobber, a strike indicator rather. Everybody knows the difference between a bobber and a strike indicator. I've told this joke multiple times. About $4.99, right? As fly fishers, we have strike indicators. We don't have bobbers. We don't have fishing line. We have tippet. We have all these nice names we like to use. But a tapered leader here, and this is a tapered leader like a 9-foot or a 12-foot. It's in trout size leaders. Its primary function is for turning over dry flies, presentation. And it's got that, your 9-foot leader, 50% of that leader, 4.5 feet, is butt section. And then it tapers to tippet. Thick diameter nylon sinks slower than thin, right? So that's not going to get you a true sink. And this is a scenario that happened to me. I had 2 anglers in my boat. I've got one gentleman on the bow who's catching fish on chironomids, 10 feet of water, 8 feet down, pretty regularly, every 15 minutes or so. Gentleman on the stern hasn't touched a fish in over an hour, and I can hear the huffing and the puffing going on, and I'm in the middle supposed to figure this out for them. So went through all the usual, what size, what color, what depth, still no joy. Finally, the gentleman who wasn't catching fish says, I don't think I'm at the right depth. So we took the 2 indicators, placed them together, and I stroked the leaders from the indicator to the flies, and to the millimeter, they were at the same depth. But in that process, I could feel one leader went from thick to thin while the other was level all the way through, right? And I said, I think it's your leader. So we changed him up to this kind of system. Makes a cast, catches a fish. Makes a cast, catches a fish, and they went toe-to-toe for the rest of the year. It was that difference, because the more bugs that get in the water, and particularly with chironomids, the more focused of the zone of feeding the trout will get on, where they won't move more than 6 inches or a foot to eat. They just swim like this. All the food they ever need is right in front of them. So little fish moves along. He simply didn't see the chironomid, and he wouldn't eat it. And that's happened on a couple of occasions. So again, these level leaders. If you don't want to use a level leader like that, you can also use just straight tippet. The other reason I like using that indicator leader is the stiff butt section through loop to loop will not cut into the fly line. If you used 8 or 10 pound leader material and try to loop connection, there's a chance that that'll bite and cut into your, much more expensive fly line and cause it, water to get in it and just damage the line itself. So that's why I like those, because the leader's got a little bit of backbone to it to turn over the whole rig. But again, from the indicator to the fly or flies, it's level all the way down. Okay, so that leader's 10 feet. If I want to make a 15-foot leader, I'm going to have that 10-footer, and then I'm going to add perhaps 3 feet of similar or one size less nylon tippet with a triple surgeon's knot. Then at times I swivel about a size 14 or 16, and then 2 feet of tippet fluorocarbon below that, and that's my indicator setup. Now if I want to change my indicator length, I ebb and flow it between the main leader and the swivel. I always keep the distance from my swivel to my final tippet section at about 2 feet. If it's shallow, I might go 18 inches because there's only so much workable water you've got. So that's where you ebb and flow, is that middle section of the leader. One of the things you find with indicator systems, as you get longer and longer leaders, nylon stretches. So I learned this method. This is Ernie Gully's a great guide on Rowley in California. And that lake, the fish feed on chironomids quite deep. We were fishing that day 18, 19, 20 below indicator. When you have a nylon-based leader system with a quick release indicator, when you set the hook, those indicators work on tension. So if there's not enough tension or your strike's absorbed, the indicator won't release consistently. So now you've got this fish fighting on the leader, the indicator hasn't popped, the indicator's jammed up at the rod tip, and this fish is 19 feet away. It makes it a bit of a challenge to land. You got to try and pull the line in, grab the peg out, make it slide out that way. It's a bit of an interesting dance to watch. So what they do there is make these non-stretch leaders. So what this is made of, this is 15 feet or so of 20 to 30 pound braid, like fire line, spider wire, all of those braids that conventional anglers use. And all that does is add no stretch to your leader. So on this leader setup, we've got a bobber stop. I'll talk about those in a second. We've got the quick release indicator, the braided leader to a swivel or a tippet ring, and then below that is your fluorocarbon. And it could be in 2 sections there. That's probably an exception where the swivel is more than 2 feet above the flies, and it's simply to provide a no stretch section in your leader, so in deep water situations when you set the hook it'll pop. Now this leader is not fun to cast. Okay, this is not something you want to make 3 or 4 false casts. We use a lot of roll casts when we indicate our fish because it's a tangle prone system. The roll cast is your friend, so you just make a roll cast and lob this out. And generally with indicator fishing, the deeper I am fishing, the closer to the boat I keep the leader, the indicator. And when we were doing it that day in California, we were literally fishing 4 feet off the rod tip because that fish is 18, 19 feet down. As long as you're not having a party up above, the fish don't really care about what's above their head, and they're just cruising around, and they'll eat. Because when there's 18 feet between your indicator and your fly, when that fish takes the fly and starts to move away with it, it takes a little bit of delay for it to transmit up the leader to the indicator, and when it does, you've got to be on it really quick. So if you've powered that indicator way out there, you're going to miss a lot of fish. You might not even see them because some of these takes, they're not going to crush this fly usually. They're just going to take it, inhale it, and as soon as they start to feel resistance or it's not right, they're already exhaling it, right? So you've got to be quick on the draw. So these quick release indicators, I like to put them on the leader with the peg on the fly side because these can cause tangles. So if a leader's unrolling this way, it's less likely, if you've tailed the loop a little bit, it's less likely to catch that peg, tumble the indicator, and start the makings of a tangle. And then once you get it in place, then I pull the peg out or so. That's not a couple inches, but about that long. And then push it back, and that causes the leader to buckle. And you pinch this loop when you're done. I like about a 3/4 inch loop or so. Pinch it in there and held there by tension. When that indicator is sitting there like this and it starts to show a take, you setting the hook and the fish reacting, puts the tension on that, which trips the indicator, and now it's free to slide. This is by far my favorite style of indicator because most other indicators, I call them fixed position. Once you lock them in place, they're stuck there. So you can't fish deep water effectively or at all because the indicator is now a barrier to landing the fish. It's stuck up at the rod tip and this fish is further away than you can grab it or net it. For me, it's about 12 feet because that's a simple function of me standing in my boat with a long-handled net to do this. If I'm in a float tube or pontoon boat, lower, it's even less. So that's why we like these quick release indicators. A game changer when it came to deeper water indicator fishing. So I mentioned swivels. These are very popular and we're using them in sizes 12 through 16. There's no consistency between swivel manufacturers. Somebody's 12 if somebody else is 16. So you get an eye for them. And we get them in silver, black nickel, copper. I like copper ones in the fall. They seem to work well. Low angle of the sun just seem to reflect. When the hatch is strong, we will use silver swivels as a point of attraction. It'll catch light, perhaps like a salmon angler uses a flasher to draw fish over. Because in some hatch situations, you can have thousands upon thousands of natural pupa coming out, and you're trying to make your fly stand out in the crowd so it'll get eaten. The heavier swivels, if it gets windy, it'll help lock and hold that fly down and dampen the effect of the wind. If you're, sometimes when you attach fluorocarbon, softer nylon, if you're not careful, it can bite in and stress the knot, and then you get a fish and you break at the knot connection. Because you have a swivel between your nylon leader and your fluorocarbon, the two never talk to each other. So it reduces that incompatibility. The swivels spin. So they'll help reduce tangles. Any sort of English you put into the cast that may lead to a tangle can be absorbed by the swivel somewhat. It helps reduce quick release indicator peg loss. When you have an indicator with a peg sitting below it and you break off a fish, it's going to trip the indicator. The black plastic peg is going to slide off the leader, sink to the bottom, and then your indicator is going to slip off the leader and drift off into the sunset. When you have the swivel there, when that breaks, typically it's going to break at the fly or the lower end of the swivel, the way the leader is based to go. That's still going to trip the indicator. Your peg's going to come down and hit the swivel. It in turn is going to stop your indicator from coming off. Just reattach some tippet, new fly, you're back in the game. You haven't lost everything. Helps determine depth and color. It is common when fishing swivels to get a take and there's nothing there. Goes down, you set the hook, nothing. Or you foul hook the fish. And what's happened is the fish has actually taken the swivel, right? They just put it in their mouth, they don't know what it is, and you set the hook, you pull the fly up into them, and you end up with a foul hooked fish. So that's usually an indication, if it's happening consistently, to raise your fly, if you're fishing a single fly, for example, up to where that swivel's hanging. Okay? So handy things to have. And I've got, again, don't ask me where I got this. It's one of those things you pick up, and I keep all my swivels in there. Yes. And if you're bored, you can play games with them, put the eyes in the marbles in the eyes of the clown. Bobber stops. Handy little thing. Because when we're fishing indicators and we hook a fish and it trips the indicator, we all want to put our indicator right back where it was prior to that to catch fish, right? And then after a while, we're not sure if we put it back in the same spot. That little doubting voice gets in your head and you start to doubt and second guess yourself. What we do with these, and I'll pass them around, they're little rubberized stops, and slip bobber fishermen use them, bass fishermen use them to keep their tungsten weights. Cheech, you probably know these things, right? Yeah. Are they called bobber stoppers in that bass application?
They call them bobber stoppers or pegs.
Yeah.
Pegs, you're doing some punching mats.
Yeah, to keep the weight at the end of the leader, at the end of the line. Yeah, so what we do with those is they come on a wire loop, and you feed about 3 or 4 inches of through that loop, and then grab that bobber stopper and pull on it, and what it does is it slides off of the wire loop and folds the leader, the tip of the leader in the process. And you keep pulling and pulling and pulling, and eventually that 4-inch section of leader flips out. And you've transferred the bobber stopper from the wire loop onto your leader. And you slide that up your leader. So this goes on first. Then your indicator goes on. Then you swivel if you're using them, and then your flyer flies. So what this means is at the end of this, right? We doing again? Try again. Yeah, and yes, this is on backwards. Like I said, put your peg on the other side. So this is on the fly line side, right, on first. So when I set my depth, I just slide this bobber stopper right adjacent to the indicator. So when it trips again, and I want to get back in the action quick, I just put my peg right back where that bobber stopper is, and I'm off and running again.
You would have to set the monofilament because if it's floating, it's just going to automatically be up against.
Well, this is back. This is actually backwards. It doesn't get in the way. Yeah, this is on the fly line side, and this, if I had this picture, I was fishing and being lazy. This is sitting here. Yeah. So it hasn't gotten away before her ever.
No, what I'm asking is you would have to fold the monofilament over because it's against the hard plastic insert, the peg.
Yeah.
So if that's above, right? If that's on the fly line side, so the peg's here.
Yep.
It automatically, when it goes down, it's going to be in contact with that.
Maybe if you had a split shot or something that's heavy enough to
Yeah.
go through, I don't know.
But no, I've never found it to be an issue. It pops right now. This is just a paranoid protector. You know, that that little dark voice that, Mom never loved you, you were never the favorite one. All this, that voice that plays on you, this you were set right back where you started from, right? Other things, quick release indicators, they wear out after time. And when the fishing's hot and heavy and you want to catch fish again, at some point you're going to have to replace your indicator. Because what's happening is the peg, because it's been popping so much, that hole is starting to wear and become larger and larger. So what you do is have a roll of black electrician's tape with you, take off about 5/8 of an inch or so, wrap it around the black peg a couple of times. That builds up the diameter of the peg temporarily, and you're back in the game and you have a nice snug fit, and the indicator will trip consistently again. Just a quick fix. Eventually you're going to have to replace that poor tired indicator and send it off to the Indicator Hall of Fame. Sometimes when you're fishing, bright colors work best with kind of high sun at your back. But I saw this trick on Pyramid Lake where the water there has the weeds, the algae is a really bright light green, and it makes bright colors really hard to see. So the locals there would take their indicators and again with the black Sharpie, give it a quick darkening and make it silhouette a little bit. So again, more value to having a Sharpie in there for you. Setting depth, sometimes you can get away with an approximate setting, but how we do this is we actually attach a weight to the fly once it's set. And just to show here, so I attach a weight to I get the fly approximately set where I think it's going to be, but I want to confirm. So what I do is I put a weight on the end of it. So that weight, can I go backwards? That weight can be, this is a slinky, a pair of hemostats. These, up in Canada, we have that thing called winter. So these are used for ice fishing. They're called depth locators, I think. So you attach that to your fly and lower it down, and because it weighs more, it's going to pull your indicator under the water. So this distance between your indicator and the surface translates, when you take that weight off, to this distance here. Okay, so you will make a visual judgment and say, okay, I want to be a foot off the bottom, because when I'm indicator fishing, I like to start about a foot off the bottom and work my way up. The majority of the fishing I find is within a foot of the bottom. Right? So it's down there. So I'll adjust the leader, relower it, make sure it's fine, and then I know I've got my fly set properly. This works really well too if you don't have any way of knowing how deep you are. Right? And you do it right beside the boat. Okay? So that's sort of strike indicator stuff. Yes? That's challenging because it's never knowing. I use a lot of electronics. I use electronics. I like to know how deep I am. I think it's critical. Yeah.
Speaking of electronics, I don't know if you're going to go into it, but we have some people on YouTube fish finders,
Love them.
and what your thoughts are on fish finders and electronics.
Okay, do you want to answer those now, or do you want to?
No, you just, I'm not sure if you're...
Yeah, I've got a slide at the very end on electronics. I'll dovetail it into there. So this is the naked technique. This is the way I learned to fish chironomids because indicators weren't available. This is long leader stuff. It's still basically the same premise that we are tracking our flies through a zone like an indicator setup. But it's more fidgety, it's more finessey. There's more things, you get more variables you've got to play with. But the beauty of this method, if you learn to fish this technique, and we use it to fish Chironomid Pupa, Chironomid Larva, scuds, mayfly nymphs, anything you want. It's long leader nymphing, right? And it teaches you patience and touch. You will learn by using this method to detect really subtle strikes, right? And we'll walk your way through this. So it's generally a method I like to use 15, 20, 25 feet of water, okay? So fly lines make a difference both for indicators and this technique. I like a fly line that's like a nymph style taper, aggressive front taper that's designed to turn over indicators. Those kind of rigs will turn over long leaders too. I'm going to sneeze in a second. So these are the lines like the indicator lines or lines that are designed for casting fast action rods. They'll actually up the line weight in the head section to flex the rod more. That will help turn over both indicator systems and long leaders. Midge tips are a part of this naked technique too. And a midge tip, if you're not familiar with it, or a clear tip, there's lots of different brands out there with different names on them. I like the 3-foot ones, the subtle ones. They're basically a really subtle sink tip. They're a floating line with 3 feet of a clear intermediate tip on there. So I like to use these in deep water or when the chop is up. When it's starting to get, the waves are coming up, you're starting to get those foam lines forming, maybe even a few white caps, and your indicator's doing this in the chop. It's hard to see. It may be herky-jerking your fly all over the place, whereas that midge tip will pierce into that surface chop and allow you to stay in control and in touch with your flies. We use it for dry fly fishing, right? A lot of times, if it dries on a pretty special occasion for me, a lot of times we're picking up and we're shotgunning. Right, put it down, pick it up, nothing comes up, and just work around and try to find those fish. They're not rising consistently. And a lot of the flies we like to use, English style flies that are damp. So if we're picking up and laying down, a midge tip, if you cast it out, greased up that fly, it's lying damp in the surface film, that midge tip will eventually pull the fly under. The second it goes under, you start a hand twist retrieve and bring it back. Right? And so you're getting a 2-for-1 deal. You're getting a dry presentation and sort of that gangly looking moving fly just beneath the surface, and you catch a lot of fish on those retrieved flies. If you don't want to invest in a midge tip, you can make one with a Versi tip or a poly leader, loop-to-loop connection. They come generally a little longer lengths, but they're a good alternative as well, and good if you travel. You can put a few in your bag if you don't have baggage allowance space to put another spool or reel in there. The leader system for this is totally different, almost the opposite of an indicator leader, in that we're using a tapered leader to help slow and control the descent of the fly. Plus, again, the leader has to be able to present, and you also got to be able to cast this thing. So I use a 15-foot leader. If I want to make a 20-foot leader, I use a 15-footer and add 5 feet of fluorocarbon tippet, sometimes with a swivel if there's a little bit of wind up, and that's a 20-foot leader right then and there. When I first started this, there was all kinds of leader formulas out there. You'd attach different lengths, different diameters together, and once you ended up with a leader, I could never make the same length twice, and all those little bumps would grab every piece of junk and debris in the water and sometimes bind on the rod guides too. So this is yes, you can. If the wind's up, I will add a swivel between the main leader and that tippet section. Now if I wanted to make a 25-footer, 15 feet, 5 feet of similar or lesser diameter nylon, and then the fluorocarbon for the final tippet section. Okay? So this is how it works. You've got, remember on these TVs, the pointer doesn't work. There's your 15 feet or so of leader, and then your tippet section, triple surgeon's knot or a swivel. Now, because this leader doesn't go off the line and sink like this, it kind of it droops, it sinks in an arc. right? So we have to compensate for that arc by leader length so we can target the area of water we want to hit. So we use a basic guideline at 25% longer than the water you're trying to reach, okay? So if you're trying to target, my favorite way for this is in this deeper water. If I want to hit 18 feet down, I'm going to need 22.5 feet a leader. That's simply 18 times 1.25 to get down, because that's how the leader sinks. But that slow sink rate of that butt section, you can keep a painstaking slow retrieve that we use with this method. Because if you retrieve too fast, the fly starts to follow the retrieve and pulls up out of the target zone. I'm casting this stuff. I like long rods, minimum 9 feet. I actually use 10-foot rods most of the time in the 6-weight range. You can break your wrist slightly to open the loop. Smooth power, proper rod stop, let the line lay out behind you, sort of the basic casting techniques we were taught with smaller leaders. You know, most people get intimidated by a 20, 25-foot leader. I always joke, my oldest son Brandon at the time was about 8. He was casting 18 and 20-foot leaders because he didn't know you weren't supposed to, right? Because he just cast and away you went. So you can definitely cast long leaders. I will fully admit your margin of error is a lot narrower if you punch a cast, you know, or don't come to a complete rod stop, all that kind of stuff. And to help turn them over, you can actually shoot the line until it comes tight to the reel, or actually pinch it, and that'll flip everything over, right? So that's what I mean by slingshotting. And minimal false cast, that makes sense, right? So the 4 keys to success with this are your leader length, that's the 25% rule, right? So you can get down there. Speed of the retrieve. The retrieves are slow with this technique. So if I'm doing a retrieve, I've got no tip section on here because of lights and ceiling fans. So when we make a cast with this method, the rod tip is down right at the surface, so my fly line is about that far off the surface, just a little droop, and then up in the hands, and you can either pinch against the cork, or I like actually to hold the line between my thumb and forefinger, and we use 2 retrieves to go with. The first is the hand twist, which is a common retrieve where you bring the line back in, catch it with your pinky, figure 8, hand twist, hand weave, retrieve, okay? You can vary the length of the pull by the number of fingers you involve. So when I chironomid fish, instead of using all of my hand like this, where I'm using the pinky to make the pull, you can use your ring finger, you can use your middle finger. So when I'm using this method and fishing with chironomids like this, I'm actually just going like this and using my middle finger at about this pace. Right? You're not going to die of exhaustion with this. There's no ripping and stripping. Well, you are going to die because you're going to catch lots of fish and be tired from that, which is a good thing. Right? You are retrieving the fly line so slowly that if it's lying on the surface and there's any kind of little squiggle or memory, it's not going to pull out. So if you start retrieving and your fly line starts to straighten like this, you're going too fast. Okay? And you actually use these little squiggles as strike indicators. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay? Weight of the patterns. This is primarily a weighted pattern. On a really calm day, low wind, you can use just a regular unweighted fly. It'll get down there eventually. And sink time. I always start off with a minimum 30 seconds. I use my watch. So if you ever see me on the lake and I'm standing like a teapot, that's because I'm watching my watch. I make a cast, and because I can't seem to count past 10 and stay focused, I go, okay, 10 past. I know at 22 on the minute hand, I got to start retrieving. And I always start the retrieve with 2 quick strips to ensure I'm tight to the fly, and being an optimist, if any fish is in the neighborhood, it sees that fly jump quickly and might attract it to grab it. Most people struggle, and again, lakes, is they don't move their flies slow enough when they're using imitative techniques, and don't allow their flies to sink long enough. Because 30 seconds to some people is exhausting.
Just under an indicator?
No, this is the naked technique, under an indicator. But even with an indicator, I cast it out and I'll let it sink a good 20, 30 seconds to make sure everything's fully hung right to the bottom. Again, floating lines are the strike indicator. Some of the takes feel like a dragging sensation. The one that I really watch are these line takes. So sometimes you'll see the fly line, the tip section, just pull this way or this way. You won't even feel it. All of a sudden the tip just goes. right? That's a fish that's moved it. Or the squiggle. So you've got this little squiggle. Remember, you're going so slow that you won't take any memory out of it. So the only thing that's going to take this squiggle out is tension. Either you pulling it. So if you're going slow enough that it's doing this, and all of a sudden the fly line does that, hit it, because it's a take. Right? Smack it. And that's why this method teaches you the touch. Yes?
When you're fishing your naked technique, when you say hit it, you like to set with the rod or pull with the line?
Usually we raise, it's more of a rod raise. Yeah. Dry fly type hit. Yeah. It's just a lift to about 11, a sharp lift. Swing tipping is another way. This is more lock style because I like to look, all these techniques I'm talking about are from an anchored position. So we have total control of the presentation. But this is when you're retrieving a line, when you pull on it, the line will rise up. When you pause, it'll drop. So if you've pulled up and then paused and it drops and the line immediately starts to climb up again, you're not pulling the line. So the only thing that's pulling it is 60 feet away or so. And that's a sign there. But I like, when I'm doing this, I prefer to be either a seated position in my pontoon boat or up in my boat on a pedestal seat or standing sometimes just to stretch out. And I'm watching as close to the fly line, the end of the fly line as I can. So those are the floating line techniques. The other, we'll talk about sinking lines because people don't use these very much. But this is fishing with clear intermediates, hover lines, those kind of things. And it's a technique I like to use in deeper water, really windy conditions, because now we're only fishing 9 feet a leader, right? Usually I use like a 7.5 footer for a little backbone to turn it over and add tippet to keep it level. You could certainly use level leaders in this scenario. And we're talking hovers, clear intermediates, lines that sink 1 to 2 inches per second. That's it. And because the lines, these slow sinking lines are not density compensated, they're going to move through the water and sweep like this as they move through the water. Right? So you kind of get the chance to cover a little bit more water with this technique. The takes with this technique are confident. It's a good tug, right? Because you've got a short working distance between your fly line and the flies. And it's great when sometimes in less fertile waters where fish have to roam a bit more to feed, or the hatch isn't as concentrated, so the fish are perhaps a little bit more spread out to feed. This is a great way to sort of sweep your line through the area and catch fish. But your sink times are longer. When I talked about the naked technique, 30 seconds, 2 minutes at times with this to go down 15, 18 feet of water. Because these lines are sinking at 1 inch per second. It takes 12 seconds to go 1 foot. So it takes this is, you can do some long division, answer a few emails, balance your checkbook if we still do that anymore. The other way we like to fish lakes with fast sinking lines is a technique called dangling. I don't know if you guys have ever done this, but whenever I do on the water chironomid seminars, I have to show this method last. Because if we did this first, nobody would listen to me for the rest of the week or the weekend, because this is fun. You can see I'm like a coiled spring in this picture. This is a technique we generally do in water deeper than 20 feet deep. I have done it as shallow as 14 or 15, and water clarity is usually the governing factor. The murkier the water, the shallower you can do it, because the fish just can't see through all that murk. So what we're doing is we are taking a fast sinking, density compensated type 6 or 7 line with about 4 feet of leader, just 2 sections of tippet. We're casting it out, it hits the water, it sinks through B, and hangs vertically at point C. So you start a foot off the bottom and you let it sit or dangle for as long as you can take it. And eventually you start to get bored, and the cure for boredom is move the fly in any of these scenarios. And you start a slow hand twist retrieve, that same pace as I showed you earlier, and just take the fly all the way up until you can see that leader junction right at the tip of the rod. And the takes will either come right here as the fish follows it up, or as the fly dangles. And the only thing with this method, you can fish into the teeth of a nasty wind. Lance and I can talk back and forth because we're not watching fly lines, we're not watching indicators. The only thing is never, ever let go of your rod. Because you think you're fast, you're not that fast. The first time I ever did this, the take went from here. In the blink of an eye, the rod went down between my legs, I was in a belly boat, and out behind my butt. And the fish, when I got it in, was that big. So you imagine a 5 or an 8 pound rainbow or a brown latches onto this thing, it's mayhem. I've actually watched rods bend over a gunnel of a boat in the most ugly angle you've ever seen. Or you almost want to wear safety glasses because you're expecting graphite showers at any second. So how do we set this up? We good? It's very similar to how we set up indicators. I attach a weight to the fly. I lower that down until it hits the bottom, and the rod just sits like this. And eventually you'll pull the weight up, whether it's a pair of hemostats, the depth finder, whatever you're using, and it'll pull the tip down. It almost feels like a fish has got it. So now your fly and the weight is literally just on the bottom. You'll make a 1 foot pull, right? Reel that slack in, strip the line in and take the weight off and cast it out. And that ensures that the fly is going to sit and hang just at the bottom. And again, sit there. Now, if you're doing this with droppers, it's not inconceivable for a fish while you're setting all this up to munch the upper fly. And you add a good pound of weight to your fish when that happens. So, electronics are important in this, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm a big believer in using electronics when I lake fish. I always joke if fly fishers if there's a difficult way to do it, fly fishers will find it, right? So for years, electronics were frowned upon, considered cheating, and I call them sounders, not fish finders, because fish finding is a component of what they do. And my analogy is they're a bit like a DSLR. You can spend a lot of money on a Sony, a Canon, or whatever brand of high-end DSLR you want to use, and you can put the battery in, power it up, put it on auto, and take pictures, right? It's a glorified iPhone without all the other features an iPhone has, just simple picture taker. But if you want to get the most out of that unit, you're going to start to learn the different settings and make it work for you. So my recommendation is you buy the most expensive sounder you can justify, get away with, whatever sort of approval process you have to go through at home to get this, and then learn how to use it. So resources like YouTube, all those kind of things. So I use a hummingbird finder. I'm just getting a new type Helix 7 because it's a 7-inch screen. I like a big screen. You know, some you can get 10 or 12. You can get Netflix, Amazon Prime on them, it seems, all this stuff. But you learn how to use the features because you can adjust the depth, you can tell bottom contour content. They will certainly mark fish as well. And when we're deep water fishing in water 20 feet or more, I believe the sounder will mark fish better, and I'm more likely to believe it. I'm just not always in the belief in 4 feet of water a fish is going to allow you to drive over it, right, and tolerate it so it registers. So again, I use it for that. Tells you your water temperature, all those kind of things. So when we're doing this dangling technique, we tend to do it either A, we mark fish, B, we'll see a chironomid emergence in deep water, birds or bugs coming out of the water, or we'll fish right where a drop-off slopes off, and when it finally hits the basin, sort of right where that slope starts to flatten out. Fish like to cruise along that. And that's a good basis point. So sounders are an important component of this dangling technique, but especially for other stillwater techniques I have as well. I always like to know how deep I am, what kind of bottom am I over, what the structure is, if I can mark fish. I've got a sounder with GPS features on it as well, so you can mark waypoints, come back to those spots, those subtle little spots that you don't always, they're hard to find again a second time around. So I know I rambled on for a while. I was getting me to shut up is the problem. We kind of reviewed strike indicator techniques, talked about the deep water no stretch system. Remember with your indicator setups, the most important thing is that level leader between your indicator and your fly or flies. So when you set it for 8 feet, it's a true 8 feet. Nothing's lost because of the differing diameter leader if you use a standard tapered leader. We talked about the naked technique, long line nymph fishing with weighted flies, painstakingly slow retrieves. Remember, let the fly sink and then retrieve it slow enough. You go too fast, it'll start to climb. Use that line as a guide. If you're dragging it across a relatively smooth surface, any squiggles should not come out. If they're starting to straighten or you're making a wake with your line, you're going way too fast. Okay? Slow sinking line techniques, a lot of fun, good in windy conditions, shorter leaders. We're talking clear intermediates, hovers, greater, a better take on there because of the shorter leader distance. It's a lot of fun, but again, longer sink times. And again, some people to let a fly sink 2 minutes is agony for them. And then the dangling technique, that is a lot of fun. It's a good, hard technique. I use that dangling technique at home to catch walleye. Instead of suspending chironomids, I'm suspending balanced minnows and things like that. So a lot of this stuff is contained on the Stillwater fly fishing app that Brian Chan and I developed. We got a lot of these on there. It's a free download for Google and Apple and iPhone. They're all video tips. We have over 120 tips on there so far. Some links to some good partners like Fly Fish Food as well. And some of the content is free, other is subscription based, and we put new tips out every month. And the key thing with this app too is once you download the content to your phone, you don't need Wi-Fi to access it. So it's a resource Brian and I put together so you can use on the water to help you get through some of this stuff. Any other questions at all?
Bill, when you're using your indicator lead, what tippet material do you use? I know you use little garbage.
Yeah.
What size?
I try to get away with the heaviest tippet I can get away with. I'm probably going to start with a indicator leader that's around a 2x breaking strain. And then if I'm going to extend that leader, I'm going to add either 2x or 3x. And then below my swivel, I'm probably still going to be 3x fluorocarbon, right? Just for horsepower to get the fish in, release it again. It's not quite like, lance with Euronymphing, you got to have the thin diameter to cut through. Because we have the luxury of being able to wait, we don't have current. We do have current in lakes, but nowhere near like a river or a stream. We have the luxury of being able to wait for this whole thing to sink if we're patient. Yeah. And that middle section of the leader again, that's where I ebb and flow. So I got a 10-foot indicator leader, a middle section that varies depending on the depth of water and trying to target, and then that 2 feet of fluorocarbon tippet from the swivel to the fly. Okay, and then that's where I ebb and flow, that midsection between swivel and main leader. Right, because you don't want to cast a leader longer than you have to. Right, you always want to keep your indicator within a couple 3 feet of the end of your fly line. It casts way better. As soon as you get your indicator way out to the far end of the leader, it becomes awkward and unbalanced, and it will not cast very well at all, which will cause you to overpower it, to punch it.
Short leaders?
No.
Shallower water?
Yes. Yeah. So if I want to fish a shallow water like 6 feet down, I'm probably going to I might just have that 10-foot leader, a swivel, and then my tippet section, right? If I want to go fish 16 feet down, I'm going to have 10 feet, and I've only got about, let's say, 7 feet of workable leader, because remember that thick butt section? So I got 7 feet. I might want to add 6 feet of nylon tip, swivel, and then 2 feet of fluorocarbon to reach a foot or so off the bottom. Okay, so you're always playing around with it. You always want to adjust, just like I guess nymphing on traditional nymphing on rivers and streams. You're always adjusting your amount of shot and your indicator placement so you can get it down. Sometimes we get lazy and we just fish the one way and it works good for a while, and then you move and it don't work so good anymore. Any questions online, Cheech? Are they still awake out there?
Yeah, they're awake. One of the questions is, what's the difference between a buzzer and a chironomid?
0.
Yeah.
Okay.
So explain that.
Yes, and I was out on Crittenden earlier this week, and you got to see that firsthand. In England, they're called buzzers because when the adults are flying around in large numbers, you can hear the hum and the whine of the wings, right? And they buzz, and that's where they get their nickname. So buzzers, chironomids, midges, all the same thing.
Somebody also said they were looking at your videos and they said they look just like mosquito larvae.
To some degree. Mosquito larvae they're air breathers, so they'll sit upside down and tip the tip of their abdomen to breathe, whereas chironomid larvae are worm-like and live along the bottom. The adults look very similar. They're both out of the Diptera, two-winged order in the insect world, but thankfully the female chironomids don't bite. They don't need blood for their the egg process. And I have walked through large swarms of them. They don't taste all that good. Frankly, I don't see what trout see in them. They just make me gag.
Another one regarding hooks and tying. What's your go-to curved shank and what's your go-to straight shanked hook?
My go-to, as far as brand? Yeah, my go-to curved, I like the Daiichi 1120 or any heavy wire scud hook, right? A stout, strong hook. Scud hooks are great because they're short shanked, so you can get away with a bigger hook to imitate a smaller bug as opposed to a standard length hook. Once they hook into a fish, they're very hard for a fish to throw, right? And they got that nice wide gap. If I'm using a standard shank hook, I would just use a standard, I'm trying to remember the number in Daiichi, but just a standard wet fly hook, you know. Yeah, 1530 would be a good combination.
1530, 1550, one of those.
Yeah, and a lot of people like to use 2X curved nymph hooks like the 1760 Daiichis, 2302 Tiemcos that are still a strong hook. Some of the some hooks have a real sprout bend, and when they're taken subtle, I find they don't tend to hook nearly as well. Another popular one in the Pacific Northwest are the Alec Jackson silver coverts, I think they're called. They're in all silver. They come in a black phantom finish. They're a popular hook as well. Very strong and stout.
So, what's your current? These are Swenny's questions. What's your current favorite gill material for chironomids?
Unifloss, because it fluoresces.
Unifloss.
So I will use, I walk up and down your aisles with your fancy blue light you have there, and to me, if the material fluoresces, I like to use that because if I'm going to use that pupa in deeper depths, it's going to stand out in the crowd a little bit by grabbing any available light and fluorescing back out. But other tires use Uni-Stretch to good use. Ostrich Hurl is one of the nicest, best materials because it moves and breathes like the natural gills do, but it tends to get fouled up and it's brittle and those kind of things. That was stuff we used to use years ago before all these yarns and synthetics became available.
One of the things that I've tried as well as with a yarn is if you get it wet and it goes clear, it's no bueno.
No,
you want it to stay nice and white, right?
Still got to stay stark white, and that's why we go to the white beads in the murky water because it does get stained up and becomes no bueno.
Does it make a big difference on if you use gill or white bead?
Sometimes, yes. In clear murky water, a white bead is fine, but sometimes you'll have real crystal clear water, and that white bead's almost too much. It's kind of overt, and it'll turn them off, and you could have that happen on one day and go back the next day and they don't care, right? So, because light's always changing, right? With where the sun is, cloud cover, all that kind of stuff. So
do you find you tie one pattern in multiple bead colors?
yes.
Silver, gold, copper?
Yeah, though I do have sort of specific flies I use for like my Black Sally, which is just a black flash blue body with a red holographic rib. It's basically a black chromie. I like to use a black nickel bead and yarn gills on that. Whereas I'll tie a pattern I call the PBR, which is a red holographic mylar underbody, red wire rib, and stretch flex in dark red brown. And I'll tie that with a white bead. So I've kind of got different patterns I like to tie. Those are all on my YouTube channel, if I'm allowed to say that. Collaboration, remember? Yeah, so I'll have different ones like that as well.
When you're approaching a new piece or an unfamiliar piece in stillwater, what kind of structure habitat are you looking for to start?
I like areas of transition. So drop-offs, sunken islands, points, weed beds, edges of weeds, those kind of things. Trout are structure related, maybe not like a bass where it'll sit in one spot stationary, but they will still relate to it, right? So I like those areas. I'm looking for, they like to be near deep water. If you ever hook a fish, it doesn't run up the boat ramp. It zips off into deep water to try and escape. So they like to have that sort of escape route nearby. So drop-offs are a favorite place to fish because you can fish the deep side of it, the transition as well, and just onto the shelf. So drop-offs are a favorite. Weed beds are also a favorite anytime you got weeds because they get protection there because they can camouflage themselves. That's where food is. That's the Costco of the underwater world. And through photosynthesis, there's oxygen being given off by the plants as they respire through the day. That's it, as Porky Pig would say. Ba-deep, ba-deep, ba-deep. That's all, folks. Yep, sorry, one more. Mm-hmm.
You don't want to hurt this fish.
Nope.
How do you know how maybe deep to go?
Yeah, if it comes out the back end, that's too far. Yeah, it is a vacuum tool, not a plunger, a pusher. Usually you'll feel resistance, so I use the gill plate, the gill plate or the operculum. Just at that point, you just push in slowly and you'll feel resistance. Now, if you feel resistance with a throat pump like you're pushing against the wall, that's a sign of a fish that's not feeding. Because when the fish haven't been feeding for a while, their esophagus will contract. So this is common, you'll see in summer doldrums times as it's transitioning into fall. Well, you go to throat pump a fish and you feel like, boy, if I push, I'm going to break it, right? Just stop, right? Because what's happened is that esophagus is almost collapsed and the pump just can't get in. So it's just that's why we lubricate it. We keep it wet and so it'll slide down, because the directions that come with those also suggest you keep a little water in and flush it down first. Well, I don't think, it's invasive enough, I guess you could say, with what you're doing, right? But it's better than the alternative, which was the fillet knife, or the Swiss Army throat pump, as I call it. And you're also going to push or flush that food source you're trying to get back down the throat. Right? I want to grab it and pull it out. So you don't necessarily have to touch it. You push it in until far enough when you let go of that bulb, it stays collapsed. That's when you know you've got the vacuum formed. So again, you don't have to touch the food source to get it. You withdraw, up it goes, and you got it. And it'll suck up chironomids. I've sucked up leeches, small bait fish. It's once that vacuum's formed, it'll grab a lot of things. Yeah. Bueno, we're good. Thank you, everyone. Both here and out in land. Hopefully that helps.